The gravel crunched under the tires of the U-Haul as the Peterson family turned down the narrow, winding road leading to their new home. Trees loomed on both sides, their branches intertwined overhead like skeletal fingers clasping hands, blocking out the afternoon sun. The road seemed to stretch on forever, until finally the dense woods gave way to a small clearing where their new house stood. The house itself was old but well-maintained, a two-story Victorian with faded white paint and dark green shutters. The wooden porch creaked slightly as they stepped onto it, and the air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Mrs. Peterson, who had been apprehensive about moving so far from the city, couldn't help but feel a small twinge of relief. "It has potential," she told her husband with a tentative smile. "A fresh coat of paint, some flowers, it could be perfect." Mr. Peterson nodded, a bit too enthusiastically. He was the one who had pushed for the move. The long commutes, the rising cost of city living, the constant noise. He had wanted a fresh start for the family, and Hollowbrook seemed like the perfect place. The realtor had described the property as a serene retreat, perfect for raising kids. As he stood on the porch, taking in the crisp air, he felt he had made the right decision. Lily, their 7-year-old daughter, was less certain. She stood apart from her parents, her arms crossed, staring at the dark line of trees that bordered their new backyard. There was something about the way the trees swayed, even though there was no breeze, that sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching. "Lily, come help with the boxes," her older brother Jack called out, snapping her out of her thoughts. Reluctantly, she turned away from the forest and joined him. The two siblings began unloading boxes from the truck, while their parents busied themselves inside, trying to bring some semblance of order to the chaos of moving day. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows grew longer, stretching like dark fingers across the lawn. By early evening, the house was filled with the smell of pizza, their first meal in their new home. They ate in the living room, sitting on the floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. Everyone was exhausted but happy, at least for the moment. After dinner, Mr. Peterson decided to take a walk around the property. The realtor had told him there was a small pond just beyond the tree line, and he was curious to explore. As he made his way to the edge of the woods, the air grew cooler. The ground beneath his feet was soft, damp with the scent of decaying leaves. He paused for a moment, feeling an odd sensation, like he was being watched. Shaking it off, he continued on. But the feeling lingered. Meanwhile, inside the house, Mrs. Peterson was tucking Lily into bed. The child was unusually quiet, her eyes darting toward the window that overlooked the forest. "Mom, can I sleep with the curtains closed?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Peterson frowned. "But you always love looking at the stars, sweetie." "Not tonight," Lily insisted, her gaze fixed on the dark woods outside. "Please." Giving in, Mrs. Peterson drew the curtains shut and kissed Lily goodnight. As she turned to leave, Lily grabbed her hand. "I heard someone," she whispered urgently. "A voice, calling my name." Mrs. Peterson's smile faltered. "Sweetie, it's a new house, new sounds. It's probably just the wind." But deep down she felt a sliver of unease. "We're safe here," she added, trying to reassure both her daughter and herself. But as she left the room, closing the door behind her, Lily lay wide awake, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest. The whispering she'd heard earlier, it didn't sound like the wind. It was a child's voice, soft and playful, beckoning her into the woods. That night, as the Petersons settled into their new home, the forest came alive. The wind howled through the trees, and the branches scraped against the windows like claws. In the darkness, something moved between the trees, something that had been waiting. And from the depths of the woods, barely audible but insistent, came a whisper. The morning sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of the Peterson household, casting a warm glow that did little to chase away the lingering chill from the previous night. Mrs. Peterson was the first to awaken, moving groggily through the kitchen to make coffee. The night's strange sounds, branches scraping against the house, the distant howls of wind had kept her tossing and turning. But it was Lily's fear-stricken eyes that troubled her the most. She tried to shake it off. New places took time to get used to, after all. "Morning, everyone!" Mr. Peterson called cheerfully as he walked in, clearly determined to start their first full day in the new house on a positive note. Jack trudged into the kitchen, yawning, while Lily stayed unusually quiet, picking at her breakfast. As they ate, a sudden knock on the door echoed through the house. The sound was sharp and urgent, as though whoever was there didn't intend to wait long. Mr. Peterson raised an eyebrow at his wife, who could be visiting this early, way out here. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, according to the realtor. Opening the door, Mr. Peterson found himself face to face with an elderly woman. She was short and stooped, her gnarled fingers clutching a wooden cane that looked like it was carved from one of the twisted trees from the woods. Wisps of thin white hair framed her wrinkled face, and her eyes were a piercing gray, sharp and alert. "Good morning," Mr. Peterson greeted, trying to mask his surprise. "Can I help you?" The woman's gaze flicked over him, then past him into the house. "You're new here," she said, her voice gravelly and low. "I'm Mrs. Halverson. I live down the road." Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped forward, peering into the living room where Jack was setting up the TV. "Well, it's nice to meet you, Mrs. Halverson," Mrs. Peterson said, trying to inject some warmth into the conversation. "We're still getting settled in." Mrs. Halverson ignored the pleasantries, her eyes darting toward the stairs. "You have children, don't you?" she asked abruptly. Mrs. Peterson hesitated. "Yes, 2 Jack and Lily." She gestured toward Lily, who stood halfway down the stairs, clutching the railing. Mrs. Halverson's eyes narrowed as she stared at Lily, her gaze lingering for an uncomfortably long moment. "Keep her away from the woods," Mrs. Halverson said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The room seemed to grow colder. Mr. Peterson exchanged a confused glance with his wife. "The woods?" he repeated, trying to understand. "Why? Is there something we should know?" Mrs. Halverson's expression turned grim. "Those woods, they don't like to be disturbed." Her words were cryptic, but there was an unmistakable urgency in her tone. "At night, they come alive, and they don't take kindly to strangers." Lily's eyes widened, and she gripped the banister tighter. Mrs. Peterson tried to laugh it off, though her voice sounded hollow. "Oh, it's just old superstitions, right? We're not the superstitious type." Mrs. Halverson shook her head slowly, her gaze never leaving Lily. "You can call it what you like, but you should listen. The trees whisper for a reason." She turned abruptly and shuffled toward the door, her cane tapping on the wooden floor. Before leaving, she paused, turning her head slightly. "There are things in those woods that hunger," she murmured, her voice almost too low to hear. "Keep your children close, or you may lose them." With that, she was gone, leaving the Petersons standing in stunned silence. "Creepy old lady," Jack muttered, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over the room. Mr. Peterson forced a chuckle, patting his son on the back. "She's probably just trying to scare the new neighbors. Let's not get too carried away." But Lily didn't look convinced. She kept glancing toward the windows, where the edge of the forest loomed like a dark promise. As the day wore on, the family tried to go about their routine. Jack busied himself with setting up the gaming console in the living room, while Mrs. Peterson focused on unpacking the kitchen. Mr. Peterson decided to spend the afternoon in the garden, clearing away the dead leaves that had accumulated over the years of neglect. The house seemed to breathe easier in the light of day, and the unsettling visit from Mrs. Halverson began to fade from their minds, at least for the time being. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Every time she looked toward the woods, she thought she saw movement shadows flitting just beyond the trees. As evening approached, the wind picked up, carrying with it faint, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to call her name. That night, as the family settled down after dinner, a heavy silence hung over the house. Mr. Peterson tried to lighten the mood by suggesting they watch a movie together. But Lily excused herself early, claiming she was tired. Alone in her room, she lay in bed, staring at the closed curtains. The memory of Mrs. Halverson's warning replayed in her mind. She wanted to believe it was just an old woman's ramblings, but the forest had its own voice, a voice only she seemed to hear. As the clock struck midnight, Lily was jolted awake by the sound of tapping against her window. Her heart pounded as she slowly sat up, straining to listen. The noise came again, tap, 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 like a branch lightly knocking against the glass. Summoning her courage, she crept to the window and with trembling hands pulled the curtain aside. At first she saw nothing but darkness. But then in the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, she saw them, small, pale faces peeking out from between the trunks. Their eyes glowed faintly, like distant fireflies. "Lily," the whisper came again, louder this time, almost playful. "Come play with us?" Terrified, Lily let the curtain fall back and leapt into bed, pulling the covers over her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the whispers that seemed to seep into her very bones. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the soft, persistent voices from the woods, calling her name. The next morning dawned with an eerie stillness that seemed to envelop the Peterson household. It was as if the woods had decided to hold its breath, watching and waiting. The air was thick with tension, though no one in the family spoke of it. Mr. Peterson had planned to spend the day exploring the nearby town of Hollow Brook, hoping to gather supplies and maybe make a few connections with the locals. Mrs. Peterson was determined to finish unpacking the remaining boxes, while Jack had his own plans to set up his gaming system and settle into his new room. Lily, on the other hand, woke up feeling uneasy. The whispers from the night before still echoed in her mind, like a melody she couldn't shake off. She tried to convince herself that it had all been a dream, a trick of her imagination, but a part of her knew better. As she sat at the breakfast table, absently pushing her cereal around the bowl, she noticed that her cat, Whiskers, was nowhere to be seen. "Has anyone seen Whiskers?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Maybe he's exploring the new place," Mr. Peterson said reassuringly. "Cats like to hide when they're adjusting to a new home." "Yeah, he's probably found a cozy spot somewhere," Jack added, not looking up from his phone. But Lily wasn't convinced. Whiskers was never one to wander far from her side, especially not in unfamiliar places. Feeling an anxious flutter in her stomach, she decided to look for him. She searched every room, checking behind furniture and inside closets, even calling his name softly as she walked through the hallways. But the house remained silent, and Whiskers was nowhere to be found. By late afternoon, when the sun was beginning to dip behind the treetops, Lily's worry had grown into full-blown panic. The woods, with its dark, tangled underbrush, loomed just beyond the backyard. It seemed to beckon to her, like it had last night, whispering promises she couldn't understand. "Mom, I think Whiskers might be in the woods," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, her hands stilling on the box she was unpacking. "I'm sure he's just hiding somewhere inside, sweetie. Let's wait a bit longer. Cats always come back when they're hungry." But Lily's heart was racing. The whispers had sounded so real last night, like children calling to her from just beyond the trees. What if Whiskers had heard them too? What if he had gone to investigate? Without waiting for permission, Lily grabbed her jacket and ran out the back door. The air outside was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the warm glow of the house. As she approached the tree line, the ground beneath her feet grew soft and damp, littered with decaying leaves that seemed to hiss as she stepped on them. "Whiskers!" she called, her voice trembling. The woods swallowed the sound, and for a moment all was silent. Then, just as she was about to turn back, she heard it faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. A meow. It was distant, almost swallowed by the rustle of leaves, but it was definitely Whiskers. Without thinking, she plunged into the woods, the dense trees closing in around her like a labyrinth. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The branches above seemed to weave together, blocking out what little daylight remained, and soon she was surrounded by shadows that danced and flickered like ghostly figures. "Whiskers!" she called again, her voice cracking. Another faint meow answered, this time closer, drawing her deeper. But as she pressed on, a cold wind suddenly swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint, chilling whisper. Lily, this way. She froze in place, her breath hitching. It wasn't just her name this time, it was Whisker's voice, mimicking the sound of his meow. A sick feeling settled in her stomach as she realized something was terribly, terribly wrong. Tears stung her eyes as she frantically looked around, trying to get her bearings. The trees all looked the same, their gnarled trunks twisted into unnatural shapes, like faces frozen in screams. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing from every direction. Lily, come play. Panicking, she turned around, trying to retrace her steps. But the forest seemed to have shifted. The path she thought she had taken had vanished, replaced by a wall of dense, impenetrable underbrush. The shadows lengthened, reaching for her like blackened claws, and the whispers swirled around her, teasing and taunting. Where are you going, Lily? Stay with us. Just as she was about to scream for help, she heard a new sound, a rustling in the bushes to her left. Heart pounding, she turned toward it, half expecting to see the pale faces she had glimpsed through her bedroom window the night before. But instead, Whiskers emerged, his fur bristling, eyes wide with terror. Whiskers! She cried out in relief, scooping him up in her arms. He was trembling, his eyes darting frantically around the forest. But as soon as she touched him, the whispers stopped. The air grew deathly still, as if the forest was holding its breath. Clutching Whiskers tightly, Lily turned and ran as fast as she could, branches slashing at her arms and legs, roots seeming to reach out to trip her. The forest no longer whispered. It growled, the ground rumbling beneath her feet as if it was trying to swallow her whole. Bursting out of the woods and into her backyard, she collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. Whiskers leapt from her arms, darting into the house. The house loomed before her like a sanctuary, its warm lights a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the forest. Mrs. Peterson came rushing out, her face pale with worry. Lily, where have you been? I've been calling you for hours. Lily could barely speak, her heart still hammering in her chest. The woods, there were voices, she stammered. They took Whiskers. But Mrs. Peterson just hugged her tightly, brushing the hair away from her daughter's tear-streaked face. It's all right, you're safe now, she whispered. But as she glanced over Lily's shoulder at the dark line of trees, her expression hardened. Lily was safe for now, but the woods had let her go, this time. As they went inside, locking the door behind them, neither noticed the small, crude symbols freshly etched into the trees at the edge of the forest. The strange markings seemed to pulse with a dark energy, almost as if they were waiting. The next morning, the Peterson household was quiet. The air was thick with a sense of dread that no amount of sunlight streaming through the windows could dispel. Lily stayed close to her mother's side as they ate breakfast, her eyes darting nervously toward the windows that overlooked the woods. Whiskers had taken to hiding under the bed, his fur bristling if anyone tried to coax him out. Mr. Peterson, determined to keep his family's spirits up, decided to tackle some yard work. The events of the previous night, while unsettling, could be explained away as nerves and stress from the move, he told himself. After all, the woods were just trees, nothing to be afraid of. Armed with a rake and pruning shears, he stepped out into the crisp morning air. The ground was still damp from last night's rain, and the earthy scent of wet leaves filled his nostrils. As he worked, he noticed something strange. The edge of the woods seemed closer than he remembered. It was as if the trees had crept forward overnight, encroaching upon their yard. Must just be my imagination, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But as he cleared away the dead leaves and overgrown brush, something caught his eye. The bark of the trees along the property line was covered in strange, jagged markings that hadn't been there before. Mr. Peterson knelt down to get a better look. The symbols were crudely etched into the wood, forming twisted shapes that resembled anguished faces, hands reaching out, mouths stretched wide as if screaming. The lines were too deep and precise to have been caused by an animal or natural wear. It looked like someone, or something, had carved them deliberately. "What the hell?" he muttered, running his fingers over one of the markings. As he did, a dark, sticky substance oozed from the grooves, staining his fingertips with an almost ink-like residue. It smelled faintly of decay, a scent that turned his stomach. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to rid himself of the foul substance. The sound of footsteps behind him made him jump. Turning around, he saw Mrs. Peterson standing on the porch, her face pale. "What's wrong?" she called, her voice tense. Mr. Peterson hesitated, not wanting to alarm her. "Nothing, just some old carvings," he replied, trying to sound casual. "Probably kids messing around." But Mrs. Peterson didn't look convinced. Her eyes were drawn to the tree he had been inspecting, her brow furrowing. "Kids?" she echoed. "Out here in the middle of nowhere?" He forced a laugh. "I'll just scrub them off, no big deal." But when he returned with a bucket of soapy water and a brush, he found that the markings had somehow deepened, the lines darker than before. It was as if the trees themselves were refusing to let go of the symbols. The more he scrubbed, the more the dark substance oozed out, dripping down the bark like black tears. As he worked, an unsettling feeling crept over him, the sense that he was being watched. He paused, glancing over his shoulder toward the house. Lily was standing at the window, her face pressed against the glass, staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Lily, it's okay," he called, trying to sound reassuring, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring, her gaze locked on the woods behind him. When he turned back to his task, the whispers began. Faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but slowly growing louder. They seemed to come from all around him, like dozens of voices whispering at once, overlapping and chaotic. "Get away, leave us alone, you don't belong here." His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept scrubbing, determined to erase the symbols. Then suddenly the whispers stopped. The air became unnaturally still, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. And that's when he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep in the woods. It was unlike any animal sound he'd ever heard, a chilling blend of a wolf's snarl and a hoo. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he dropped the brush, backing away from the tree. "Dad!" Jack's voice rang out, breaking the eerie silence. Mr. Peterson turned to see his son standing on the back porch, looking worried. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Mr. Peterson lied, quickly picking up the brush and bucket, just cleaning up some graffiti. But Jack's eyes widened as he took in the carvings on the trees. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Did you carve that?" "No," Mr. Peterson said, his voice tight. "And I don't want you or Lily coming near the woods, understand?" Jack nodded slowly, but the fear in his eyes lingered. The Petersons retreated inside the house, bolting the doors behind them, as if the very walls could keep out whatever was lurking just beyond the tree line. That night, the family tried to settle into their routine, but the unease hung over them like a dark cloud. Lily refused to sleep in her room, insisting that she could still hear the whispers outside her window. Mrs. Peterson let her sleep in their bed, not wanting to argue. Around midnight, Mr. Peterson was jolted awake by the sound of scratching against the house. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking across the wood. He threw on his robe and hurried downstairs, his heart pounding. Flinging open the front door, he shone his flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, only the whispering of the wind through the trees. But as he turned to go back inside, something caught his eye. The strange markings had returned, not just on the trees, but on the walls of their house. The same twisted faces, hands reaching out in agony, were etched deep into the wood. The dark, tar-like substance dripped from the grooves, pooling on the porch. The whispers began again, louder this time, almost a chorus of mocking voices. "You cannot stop it. You are ours now. She is ours." Terrified, Mr. Peterson slammed the door shut, bolting it behind him. As he leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath, he heard Lily's voice, soft and faint, coming from upstairs. "They're getting closer," she whispered. They're coming for us. The Petersons huddled together in the living room, the house filled with the sounds of scratching, whispering, and the faint cries of children drifting through the air. The forest outside seemed to come alive, the shadows shifting and writhing like hungry creatures. Somehow they all knew it. Whatever was in the woods was no longer content to stay hidden. It was reaching out, inching closer to the house. And it was only a matter of time before it came knocking on their door. The morning after, the unsettling night was cloaked in a dense gray fog that clung to the trees like a veil, muffling the world in an oppressive silence. The Petersons barely spoke over breakfast, their eyes tired and ringed with dark circles. The incessant whispers, the relentless scratching, none of them had slept. Even Jack, who had previously tried to brush off the strange happenings, was now too afraid to step outside. Lily was the most affected. She was quiet, withdrawn, and constantly looked over her shoulder, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. Mrs. Peterson, her patience frayed, decided they needed answers. If they were going to live here, they had to understand what was going on. And so, while Mr. Peterson busied himself with calling the realtor to complain about the strange markings on their property, Mrs. Peterson decided to explore the one place they had barely touched since moving in the attic. The attic had an old, musty smell that reminded her of forgotten memories and dust-covered secrets. Sunlight filtered through a small, grimy window, illuminating the cobwebs that hung like ghostly curtains. She had been meaning to clean up the space, but with everything that had been happening, it had fallen low on her priority list. Mrs. Peterson climbed the rickety wooden ladder into the attic, armed with a flashlight and a heavy-duty broom. As she swept away the cobwebs, she noticed a row of old trunks and dusty crates pushed against the far wall. It was clear that the previous owners had left behind some of their belongings. Perhaps they had left in a hurry. Perhaps they had fled. While moving a heavy, rotting box, something caught her eye. A corner of faded leather peeking out from beneath a loose floorboard. Kneeling down, she pried the board loose, revealing a small, battered journal, its cover cracked with age. The edges of the pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing inside was still legible. As Mrs. Peterson flipped through the first few pages, she realized the journal belonged to a boy named Samuel Turner, who had lived in their house decades ago. The early entries were innocuous enough, describing the boredom of a small-town life, but as she read on, the tone of the journal shifted. The writing became jagged and hurried, the words filled with fear. July 3rd, 1979. We moved into the old house today. It's bigger than our old apartment, and I have my own room. Mom says we can finally start fresh here. The woods are right behind our backyard, and they go on forever. I thought they were beautiful, but at night they sound different. July 10th, 1979. At night, I hear whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but now, I don't know. They're soft like children playing, but the words don't make sense. Sometimes it feels like they're calling my name. Mom says I'm imagining things, but I hear them every night. July 20th, 1979. I saw them today. Faces peeking out from the trees, just like in my nightmares. I told Mom, but she won't believe me. She says it's just my imagination, that I'm getting used to the new house. But the whispers, they're getting louder. They want me to come into the woods. August 1st, 1979. They took Daisy. She was barking at the woods, and then she was gone. Mom and Dad looked everywhere, but they couldn't find her. I know they have her. The faces, the voices, they're angry now. I think they want me instead. August 5th, 1979. I can't sleep. Every night, the whispers get closer. They're outside my window, scratching, begging to be let in. Last night, they told me to come play with them. I don't want to, but I'm so scared. I'm leaving this journal behind in case they take me. The last entry was scrawled so messily that it was almost illegible, but Mrs. Peterson could make out a single, desperate sentence. August 7th, 1979. If you're reading this, they got me. Don't trust the whispers. Don't let them in. A chill ran down Mrs. Peterson's spine. She clutched the journal to her chest. her heart pounding. The parallels to what Lily was experiencing were too eerie to dismiss as coincidence. She had to show this to her husband. But as she turned to leave, she heard a soft creaking noise, like the sound of footsteps on the attic floorboards behind her. Swallowing her fear, she slowly turned around, but there was no one there, only the dusty, shadow-filled corners of the attic. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. With trembling hands, she closed the journal and hurried down the ladder, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When she reached the kitchen, she found Mr. Peterson on the phone, his face red with frustration. "The realtor claims they knew nothing about it," he was saying. "No history of strange occurrences, no complaints from previous owners. They're either lying or clueless." "Mark," Mrs. Peterson interrupted, her voice urgent. "You need to see this." She handed him the journal, her hands shaking. As Mr. Peterson skimmed through Samuel Turner's entries, his expression shifted from skepticism to alarm. "You're telling me this boy was hearing the same things as Lily? And he disappeared?" "That's what it sounds like," she whispered. "But Mark, he mentioned something about the woods taking things. They took his dog, just like they tried to take Whiskers." Mr. Peterson set the journal down on the table, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said finally. "We can't stay here another night." But just as they were about to discuss their next move, a loud crash echoed from the living room. They rushed in to find Jack standing in front of the broken window, shards of glass scattered around him. "What happened?" Mrs. Peterson cried. Jack turned to them, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Something threw a rock through the window," he stammered. "I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the woods, a figure. But when I looked closer, it was like it was made of shadows, and it whispered." "What did it say?" Mr. Peterson demanded. Jack swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "It said, 'Give her to us. Give us Lily and we'll leave you alone.'" A heavy silence fell over the room as they processed what he had said. The forest was no longer satisfied with merely whispering through the trees. It was making demands now, and it had its sights set on Lily. As nightfall approached, the house felt more like a prison than a home. The family huddled together in the living room, every door and window locked, the lights turned on in every room. But they all knew the light wouldn't protect them from whatever was lurking in the darkness beyond the trees. The whispers began again just after midnight, louder and more insistent than ever. They seeped through the walls, echoing through the house like the wails of the damned. "Lily, come play with us." Mrs. Peterson clutched her daughter tightly, pressing her hands over Lily's ears to drown out the sound. But the voices wouldn't stop. They were coming closer, and they weren't going to leave until they got what they wanted. The air in the Peterson household was electric with tension. By the time dawn broke, it was clear that sleep had eluded them all. The whispers, the scratching, and the strange demands from the darkness beyond their windows had turned their new home into a waking nightmare. Mr. Peterson, running on nothing but adrenaline and fear, was packing hastily, throwing clothes into suitcases, determined to leave Hollowbrook behind once and for all. "We can't stay here another night," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "I don't care what it costs. We're leaving today." Mrs. Peterson nodded in agreement, holding Lily close. But Jack, despite the terror he had witnessed, was seething with frustration. "Dad, we can't just run," he said. "If we don't figure out what's happening, it might follow us. It wants something. It wants Lily," Mrs. Peterson interrupted, her voice breaking. "It's been clear about that, and we're not going to let it have her." But Jack wasn't convinced. He had spent the long hours of the night searching online for anything that could explain what was happening. Local legends, old newspaper articles, ghost stories, everything he found pointed to one thing. The woods behind their house were cursed, and whatever was in them was hungry. As Mr. Peterson continued to pack, Jack turned to Lily, who was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide and glassy. "Lily," he said softly, kneeling in front of her, "have you heard the whispers today? Are they saying anything new?" Lily shook her head, but then hesitated. "They're quieter now," she whispered. But they're waiting. They say they're coming for me. They said I promised to play with them." Jack's eyes widened. "Promised when?" Tears filled Lily's eyes. "I don't remember, but they said I did, a long time ago." The adults exchanged worried glances. If the whispers were telling the truth, then this was more than just a haunting. It was a pact, one they didn't understand and had no way of breaking. As the afternoon wore on, the Petersons were nearly ready to leave. The car was packed, and they had planned to drive straight through to the next town. But just as they were gathering the last of their belongings, the power went out, plunging the house into sudden darkness.
Damn it!
Mr. Peterson cursed, fumbling for a flashlight. "Get to the car, everyone. We're leaving now." But in that moment, a gust of cold wind blasted through the house, slamming doors shut and rattling the windows. The whispers surged in volume, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. "Lily, come play, come to us." "Mom! Dad!" Jack shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the rising storm outside. The air was filled with the sound of something scratching at the walls, as if hundreds of unseen hands were trying to claw their way inside. Suddenly, the front door burst open with a deafening crash, and a cold, suffocating fog poured into the house. The whispers were now screams, echoing through the hallways. The family was thrown into chaos, desperately trying to reach the car, but the fog was thickening, turning the air into a choking mist. In the chaos, Jack grabbed Lily's hand. "We're going to the car," he yelled over the howling wind. But Lily, in a daze, stared at the open door. The fog seemed to part, revealing a narrow path that led straight into the woods. I have to go," Lily murmured, her voice monotone, as if she were in a trance. "No, Lily," Jack screamed, tightening his grip on her hand. "Don't listen to them. They're lying." But something in the fog called to her, and with a sudden, jerking motion, Lily wrenched herself free from Jack's grasp. Before he could react, she darted out the door and into the woods. The fog swallowed her whole, her small figure disappearing into the darkness. "Lily!" Jack screamed, running after her, but the fog seemed to thicken with every step he took. It was like wading through quicksand. The voices grew louder, surrounding him from every direction. "Jack, get back here!" Mr. Peterson shouted, but it was too late. Jack had already vanished into the fog. Mrs. Peterson's screams filled the air as she tried to follow, but the fog was like a living thing, pushing her back. The cold was unbearable, freezing her breath as she stumbled, blinded by the mist. Mr. Peterson grabbed her, pulling her back toward the house. "We can't go after them," he yelled, his voice raw with panic. "We'll get lost too." But Mrs. Peterson was hysterical, struggling against him. "We can't leave them, we can't." "Listen to me," he shouted, forcing her to look at him. "We have to think. If we get lost too, no one will be able to find us. We need to call for help." He half dragged her back into the house, slamming the door shut behind them. The fog pressed against the windows like a living entity, the whispers now a deafening roar. Meanwhile, in the woods, Jack stumbled through the dense forest, the fog swirling around him, disorienting him. The trees twisted and warped in the dim light, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He could barely see 2 feet in front of him, but he could hear Lily's voice, soft, desperate. "Jack, help me." "Lily, where are you?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Just keep talking to me." But her voice seemed to drift, coming from different directions all at once. The whispers were everywhere, closing in, taunting him, leading him deeper into the woods. "They won't let me go," Lily's voice whimpered. "I'm scared." Jack's heart raced as he pushed forward, ignoring the cuts and bruises forming on his arms and legs from the branches that lashed out at him. He felt the ground beneath him shift, the earth growing soft and wet, like he was walking through a swamp. And then he saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in an unnatural, sickly green light. In the center of the clearing stood Lily, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was surrounded by shadowy figures, their forms flickering like dying flames. They were children, but not quite. Their faces were pale, hollow, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They reached out to Lily with hands that seemed to waver between solid and spectral. "Jack, help me." Lily's voice was faint, as if she were speaking from far away. "Let her go," Jack shouted, lunging forward. But as soon as he stepped into the clearing, the ground beneath him gave way. He was falling, plunging into darkness, the whispers consuming him. Back at the house, as the sun finally set, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson sat huddled in the living room, clutching each other. The power had come back, but the house felt colder than ever. They tried calling the police, but the line was dead. The whispers outside had grown faint, almost as if the woods were satisfied for now. The front door creaked open slowly. The Petersons turned, their hearts leaping in their chests. But it wasn't Jack or Lily. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Halverson, her face as pale as death. She stepped inside, her eyes glassy, her hands shaking. "It's too late," she whispered. "The forest has taken them. They belong to it now." Mrs. Peterson collapsed into sobs, but Mr. Peterson refused to give up. "No," he growled, his voice filled with determination. "We're going to find them. We'll go into those woods and we'll bring them back." Mrs. Halverson shook her head slowly, her expression filled with sorrow. "You can try," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising wind outside. "But the woods don't let go of what they claim." As the clock struck midnight, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the house with their dark chorus. "Come play with us, come join us forever." And somewhere deep in the forest, Jack and Lily's screams echoed back. The morning after Lily and Jack vanished, the Peterson household was a scene of chaos and grief. Mrs. Peterson sat on the living room floor, clutching a photo of her children, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Peterson paced back and forth, his hands shaking as he repeatedly tried to call the police, desperate for any sign of help. The lines were finally working again, and within an hour the police arrived at the house, their flashing blue and red lights a stark contrast against the cold, gray dawn. Sergeant Matthews, a grizzled officer with years of experience, took the lead. He was joined by two deputies, who quickly began surveying the perimeter. As the sergeant spoke with the Petersons, trying to calm them down enough to gather information, a small crowd of curious townsfolk gathered at the end of the driveway, whispering among themselves. Mrs. Peterson was inconsolable, her voice breaking as she tried to explain how Lily and Jack had disappeared into the fog. "They were right there," she sobbed. "I heard them, but the fog, it swallowed them. It was like the woods just took them." Sergeant Matthews listened with a skeptical expression, but he kept his thoughts to himself. "We'll organize a search team," he said, turning to his deputies. "We'll sweep the woods thoroughly. If your kids are out there, we'll find them." But Mr. Peterson grabbed the sergeant's arm, his grip like a vice. "You don't understand," he hissed, his eyes wild with desperation. It's not just the woods. There's something in there. It's alive. It wants Lily." The sergeant gently but firmly pulled his arm free. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but right now we need to focus on finding your children. We'll handle whatever's out there." As the search began, Mrs. Halverson appeared at the edge of the yard, her face drawn and pale. Mr. Peterson rushed over to her, grabbing her shoulders. "You knew something like this would happen," he shouted, shaking her slightly. "You knew, and you didn't warn us properly." The old woman didn't fight back. She simply looked up at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed older than the trees themselves. "I did warn you," she whispered, "but you didn't listen. No one ever does." Before Mr. Peterson could respond, a group of townspeople approached. One of them, a gaunt man with deep-set eyes, stepped forward. "The woods have taken children before," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This isn't the first time. You should have left when you had the chance. The search begins." The police wasted no time organizing a search party. As more officers arrived, they spread out into the woods in groups of two, armed with flashlights, radios, and tracking dogs. The woods, normally silent in the morning light, now seemed to hum with an ominous energy, as if it were aware of the intrusion. Mr. Peterson refused to stay behind. "Those are my children out there," he insisted, grabbing a flashlight from one of the officers. "I'm not just going to sit around while you search." Sergeant Matthews reluctantly agreed, assigning him to one of the search teams. Mrs. Peterson, though racked with anxiety, stayed behind at the house, waiting by the phone for any news. Mrs. Halverson remained with her, muttering prayers under her breath, her eyes glazed with fear. As the search teams plunged into the forest, the air grew colder. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches casting long shadows that danced in the faint morning light. The officers tried to stay focused, but the deeper they went, the more disoriented they became. The radios crackled with static, voices cutting in and out, as if the woods themselves were interfering with their signals. "Team Alpha to base," one officer radioed in. "We've reached the clearing. No sign of the children yet. Over." "Copy that, Alpha," came the static-laden reply. "Continue your search and report any findings. Over." Mr. Peterson's descent. Mr. Peterson's group ventured deeper into the forest, his flashlight beam sweeping the underbrush. Every rustle, every creak of a branch sent his heart racing. The voices he had heard last night, the whispers that seemed to come from every direction, were now silent, as if the woods were waiting, watching. Suddenly one of the officers froze, shining his flashlight on the ground. "Hey, over here!" he called out. Mr. Peterson rushed over, his heart leaping with hope. But instead of his children, they found something else. A small, battered teddy bear half buried in the mud. It was Lily's favorite toy, one she never went anywhere without. The sight of it brought tears to Mr. Peterson's eyes. "They were here," he whispered, clutching the toy to his chest. "They were here, but where did they go?" The officer looked around, his brow furrowed. "The ground's soft here, like something's been dragged through it," he said. "But the tracks, they just stop. It's like they vanished." As they stood there, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, ghostly whisper. "Come play with us." The sound sent shivers down their spines, and the officer's face went pale. Did you hear that?" Mr. Peterson nodded, his eyes wide. "We need to keep going," he insisted. "We're close, I can feel it." But just as they started moving again, the fog rolled in. It came from nowhere, thick and suffocating, swallowing the trees and blocking out the sun. The radios crackled with static and then fell silent. "Sergeant Matthews, do you copy?" One of the officers called into his radio. No response. "Stay close," the officer warned Mr. Peterson, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The fog seemed to have a life of its own, swirling around them, separating them. Mr. Peterson turned in a circle, desperately searching for the beam of the officer's flashlight. But all he saw was gray. And then, just beyond the swirling mist, he saw a figure. It was Lily, standing alone, her back turned to him. "Lily!" he shouted, rushing toward her. But as he got closer, the figure began to dissolve, melting into the fog like a mirage. The whispers came again, louder now, mocking him. "Give her to us, and we'll let you go." Back at the house, while the search party struggled in the woods, Mrs. Peterson sat by the phone, clutching it tightly, waiting for any news. Beside her, Mrs. Halverson stared out the window, her eyes distant. "The forest will not release them," Mrs. Halverson said softly. "It only takes... it never gives back." Mrs. Peterson turned to her, her voice trembling. "Why? Why our children? What do they want?" Mrs. Halverson sighed, her face a mask of grief. "The whispering woods, it's hungry. Decades ago, the townspeople made a pact. They offered the forest sacrifices, children, to keep the darkness at bay. But that pact was broken, and now the forest takes what it wants." Mrs. Peterson shook her head in disbelief. "That's insane. We don't believe in superstitions." "It doesn't matter what you believe," Mrs. Halverson replied, her voice a whisper. "The forest believes in you, and now it has your children." Just then the phone rang, shattering the tense silence. Mrs. Peterson snatched it up. "Hello? Did you find them?" On the other end there was only static, followed by a faint, childlike giggle, then a whisper. "They're with us now, forever." The line went dead. Mrs. Peterson collapsed to the floor, her cries echoing through the empty house as Mrs. Halverson whispered a prayer. The search party was lost in the woods. The police were helpless, and the forest's grip on the Peterson family was tightening. The Whispering Woods was not done with them yet. The search for Lily and Jack stretched on for hours, but it felt like an eternity for the Petersons. As evening descended, the forest became a dark labyrinth that seemed to swallow the search party whole. The once determined officers were now whispering nervously among themselves, their flashlights flickering in the gathering darkness. The radios were useless, overwhelmed with static, and the fog that had rolled in earlier was growing thicker, turning the woods into a surreal nightmare. Back at the house, Mrs. Peterson's nerves were frayed beyond repair. She sat curled on the sofa, clutching Lily's teddy bear to her chest. Mrs. Halverson, who had stayed to provide some measure of comfort, watched her with a haunted expression. She seemed to know something the Petersons didn't, something she was reluctant to share. Finally, Mrs. Peterson couldn't bear it anymore. "What are you not telling me?" she demanded, her voice a mix of fury and desperation. "You know something about these woods, something that can help us get our children back. What is it?" Mrs. Halverson sighed deeply, the weight of years of secrets heavy on her shoulders. "There's a ritual," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A way to appease the woods, but it's dangerous." "A ritual?" Mrs. Peterson repeated, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" "I hoped you wouldn't need to know," Mrs. Halverson said, shaking her head. "But the woods have taken your children, and they won't let them go without a price." "What price?" Mr. Peterson asked as he stumbled into the room, his face pale and streaked with dirt. He had returned from the search, exhausted and broken. "What do we need to do?" Mrs. Halverson hesitated. "The forest wants an offering," she explained. "It's not satisfied with simply taking children at random. Long ago the townsfolk used to make offering sacrifices to keep the forest's hunger at bay. But the pact was broken, and now it takes what it wants." Mrs. Peterson's voice cracked. "Are you saying we have to sacrifice someone?" She couldn't bring herself to say the words. The very thought was monstrous, unthinkable. "No," Mrs. Halverson said slowly, shaking her head. "Not someone, but something precious. Something that binds your family to this house." She glanced at Lily's teddy bear, still clutched in Mrs. Peterson's hands. "An offering of the heart. But it may not be enough. The forest's hunger has grown over the years. It might demand more." The Petersons exchanged a horrified glance. But what choice did they have? They had to try something, anything, to save their children. Mr. Peterson turned to Mrs. Halverson, his voice desperate. "What do we need to do? How do we perform this ritual?" Mrs. Halverson took a deep breath, her hands shaking. "We need to go into the heart of the woods, to the old clearing where the sacrifices were once made," she said. "There we'll set up a circle with salt, candles, and herbs. But we must bring something precious, something of deep meaning to your family." Mr. Peterson nodded, his jaw set. "We'll do whatever it takes. We can't lose them." The ritual in the woods. Armed with candles, salt, and herbs that Mrs. Halverson had provided, the Petersons prepared to venture into the woods. Mrs. Halverson led the way, her old lantern casting a dim, flickering light that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness around them. The air was heavy, and the forest seemed to hum with an ominous energy, as if it were aware of their intrusion. Mrs. Peterson carried Lily's teddy bear, and Mr. Peterson held a family photo, one of the last happy moments they had shared before the whispers began. They walked in tense silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional snap of a twig. The deeper they went, the louder the whispers became, surrounding them on all sides. "They're watching us," Mrs. Peterson whispered, her eyes darting around. What if it's too late?" "We have to try," Mr. Peterson insisted, his grip tightening on her hand. "We can't give up on them." Finally, they reached the clearing. It was a small, circular space surrounded by towering trees, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and cracked with age. The ground beneath it seemed to pulse, as if the forest itself were alive. Mrs. Halverson directed them to form a circle with the salt, placing candles at the four corners. She sprinkled herbs over the altar and began chanting a language the Petersons couldn't understand. The air grew colder and the wind began to howl, carrying with it the faintest echoes of children's laughter. Place the offerings on the altar, Mrs. Halverson instructed. Speak from your heart. Offer your love, your memories, your connection. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her hands trembling as she placed Lily's teddy bear on the altar. Please, please give my children back, she sobbed. They're all we have. Take whatever you want, but let them go. Mr. Peterson followed, placing the family photo beside the bear. You can take our home, our possessions, whatever you want, he said, his voice breaking. Just give us back our children, please. The wind howled louder, the whispers turning into a chorus of voices, some crying, others laughing, all taunting. The candles flickered violently, threatening to go out. Mrs. Halverson's chanting grew louder, more urgent. And then silence. For a moment it was as if the entire forest had gone still. The Petersons held their breath, waiting, hoping. But then, from the darkness beyond the clearing, came a voice familiar but distorted, as if heard underwater. Mom, Dad, help us. Jack! Lily! Mrs. Peterson screamed, rushing toward the sound, but Mrs. Halverson grabbed her arm, holding her back. It's a trick, she hissed. Don't leave the circle. But Mr. Peterson, unable to bear the thought of his children suffering, broke free and ran toward the sound. The moment he crossed the circle's boundary, the ground beneath him gave way, and he vanished into the darkness with a scream. No! Mrs. Peterson screamed, trying to reach him, but the circle flared with light, blocking her path. The forest was alive now, the trees swaying violently, their branches reaching down like skeletal arms. The whispers were deafening now. One more, one more. Mrs. Halverson's face was pale with terror. The forest wants a soul, she whispered. It's not satisfied with tokens. It wants blood. Tears streamed down Mrs. Peterson's face. Take me, she screamed to the darkness. Take me instead. Just let my children go. There was a pause, a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped. And then slowly, the ground began to tremble. The fog lifted slightly, revealing Jack and Lily standing at the edge of the clearing, their eyes wide with fear. But as Mrs. Peterson rushed toward them, the ground beneath her feet shifted. A dark, gnarled root shot up from the earth, wrapping around her ankle, dragging her toward the altar. Mama, no! Lily screamed, reaching out for her mother. But Mrs. Peterson only smiled through her tears. Run, Lily! Take your brother and run! With one final desperate effort, Mrs. Peterson pushed Lily away, letting the forest consume her. The moment she disappeared, the whispers stopped and the fog began to dissipate. The clearing was bathed in an eerie stillness, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Jack and Lily were left standing alone, shivering in the cold. The forest had claimed its sacrifice, but at a terrible cost. They were free, but at what? The forest had gone silent. The oppressive fog that had enveloped the clearing slowly dissipated, revealing Jack and Lily huddled together in the cold, dark woods. The trees, which moments ago seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, now stood still, their twisted branches hanging like the lifeless arms of ancient giants. Lily clung to her brother, tears streaming down her face. Is she really gone? She whispered, her voice barely more than a tremor. Jack held her close, his own eyes wide with shock. He couldn't bring himself to answer. The last thing he had seen was their mother's tearful face as the forest had dragged her away, her final words echoing in his mind. Run, Lily! Take your brother and run! But where could they go? The house they had once called home was surrounded by the same cursed woods that had taken their mother. Every step they took away from the clearing felt like they were walking deeper into a labyrinth with no escape. But they had no choice. Staying in the clearing was too dangerous. The forest may have claimed its sacrifice, but it felt like it was only a matter of time before it changed its mind. Come on, Lily, Jack said, his voice cracking. We need to move. We need to get back to the house. They turned back the way they thought they had come, their steps slow and cautious. the oppressive darkness seeming to swallow the beams of their flashlights. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent their hearts racing. The forest may have been quiet, but it was far from comforting. The woods felt different now. They had taken something precious, and in doing so they seemed almost satisfied. The whispers were gone, replaced with an eerie silence that was somehow worse. But the Peterson children knew better than to trust the forest's calm. Hours seemed to pass as they stumbled through the dark. Every tree looked the same, gnarled and twisted, their branches forming grotesque shapes that seemed to leer down at them. Jack tried to stay focused, but the exhaustion, the fear, and the heartbreak gnawed at him like a hungry beast. I don't think we're getting any closer, Lily said, her voice trembling. I don't see the house. Jack stopped, taking a deep breath. He was the older brother. He was supposed to protect her. But how could he protect her from something he didn't understand? We'll find it, he said, trying to sound confident. We just have to keep moving. But even as he said it, he could feel the forest closing in again, the air growing colder. The ground beneath their feet became soft and marshy, the earth swallowing their shoes with each step. The trees seemed to bend toward them, their bark etched with strange, unreadable symbols. Then out of the darkness they heard it, a soft, familiar voice. Lily. They froze. It was their mother's voice, but there was something off about it. It sounded distant, distorted, as if it were coming from deep underwater. Mom? Lily called out, her voice breaking. She tried to run toward the sound, but Jack grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Lily, no, he hissed. It's not her. It's the forest. It's trying to trick us. But the voice came again, more insistent. Jack, Lily, please help me. I'm so cold. Lily's eyes filled with tears. Jack, what if it really is her? What if she's not gone? What if she's lost just like us? Jack was torn. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap. But what if there was a chance, just a small one, that their mother was still alive? He couldn't leave her behind. All right, he said finally, tightening his grip on Lily's hand. But we stay together no matter what. We don't let go of each other. The voice continued to call, leading them deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to shift, their bark groaning as if alive, opening pathways that had not been there moments ago. The air grew colder with each step they took, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Finally, they reached a small clearing, bathed in an unnatural, sickly green light. In the center stood their mother, or at least something that looked like her. She was pale, her eyes hollow and lifeless, her mouth curved into a twisted, unnatural smile. Mom, Lily whispered, taking a hesitant step forward, but Jack pulled her back. That's not her, he said, his voice firm. Mom sacrificed herself so we could get away. This is the forest's trick. The figure that looked like their mother tilted its head, the smile growing wider, more grotesque. But I came back for you, my darlings, it said, its voice now a guttural growl. You can stay with me, forever. Jack's grip on Lily's hand tightened as he stepped between her and the creature. We're not falling for it, he spat. You already took our mother. You won't take us too. The creature's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of fury. The ground beneath their feet trembled, roots bursting forth like serpents trying to ensnare them. Jack yanked Lily's hand, pulling her away, just as the roots snapped where they had been standing. Run! Jack screamed, dragging Lily behind him. They sprinted back into the darkness, the forest coming alive with rage. Branches reached down like claws, trying to grab them, the ground heaving as if it were trying to swallow them whole. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. Overlapping voices filled with anger and desperation. You belong to us. You will never leave. But Jack refused to stop. They crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at their clothes and skin, their lungs burning with every breath. Ahead, through the thick fog, Jack saw it, a faint glimmer of light. The house. We're almost there, he yelled, his voice raw. As they burst through the tree line, the fog seemed to part, revealing their house, standing like a beacon in the night. They stumbled up the porch steps, slamming the door behind them and locking it. The whispers stopped. The silence was almost deafening, and for a moment the two of them just stood there, gasping for breath. The house was dimly lit, the air heavy with dust, but it was warm, safe. But something was wrong. The house was too quiet, too still. As they turned to look down the hallway, they saw a figure standing there, half hidden in shadow. It was their mother, or what was left of her. Her eyes were hollow, her smile twisted, her skin stretched tight over her bones. "You can't escape the forest," she whispered, her voice barely more than a rasp. "It has claimed me, and now it will claim you." Before Jack and Lily could react, the lights in the house flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to move, reaching out toward them like tendrils. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was just another part of the forest's twisted domain. In one final act of defiance, Jack grabbed Lily's hand and bolted for the back door. "We're not yours," he screamed. "We're getting out of here." But as they fled into the darkness once more, they could hear the forest's laughter, cold, mocking, eternal. The forest was not done with them yet. Jack and Lily burst through the back door, plunging into the cold night air, their hearts pounding. Behind them, the house seemed to groan and shudder, as if the forest itself were squeezing it in a tight grip. The woods were alive, their twisted branches swaying like grotesque marionettes reaching for them. But the siblings had no choice. They had to keep running. The whispers were louder than ever now, filling the air like a chorus of tormented souls. "You can't escape, you belong to us, forever." Jack tightened his grip on Lily's hand. "We have to get to the clearing," he panted. "That's where it all started. Maybe that's where we can end it." "But Jack," Lily sobbed, struggling to keep up. "Mom's gone. She's really gone, isn't she?" Jack's throat tightened, but he couldn't let himself break down. Not now. "She sacrificed herself to save us," he said through clenched teeth. "We can't let that be for nothing." The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees shifting like the walls of a labyrinth, twisting and warping to confuse them. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet turned soft and treacherous, like it was trying to drag them down into the earth. The forest had grown angry, desperate. It was not going to let them go without a fight. Ahead, through the fog, Jack saw the faint glimmer of moonlight, the clearing. It was closer than he had hoped. "Come on, Lily, we're almost there." But as they neared the clearing, a figure stepped into their path. It was their mother, or the twisted, hollow version of her that the forest had claimed. Her eyes were dark, empty voids, her skin pale and stretched thin over her gaunt frame. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice an echo of a memory. "The forest wants you. It will never let you go." Jack's heart ached seeing the broken, twisted form of the woman who had once been his mother. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. He pulled Lily behind him, shielding her with his own body. "You're not our mother," he shouted, his voice shaking. "You're just something the forest is using. Get out of our way." The figure that had once been their mother only tilted her head, a grotesque smile spreading across her lips. "The forest has taken me, and it will take you too," she rasped. "Unless—" Jack hesitated. "Unless what?" he demanded, the rage and desperation boiling over. The figure's smile widened, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in those dark, hollow eyes, a trace of the woman they had lost. "The forest, it wants a soul," she whispered. "One final sacrifice to seal its hunger. Offer yourself, Jack, and Lily will be free." Lily gasped, clutching Jack's arm. "No, Jack, you can't." Jack's mind raced. If the forest truly wanted him, maybe he could save Lily. Maybe this nightmare could finally end. He glanced at Lily, tears streaming down her pale face. He had promised himself that he would protect her, no matter the cost. "I'll do it," Jack said, stepping forward. "Take me. Just let Lily go." The creature that wore their mother's face seemed to smile, pleased. The trees around them rustled with a sudden, eager energy, as if the forest were licking its lips in anticipation. But just as Jack took another step toward the creature, a voice echoed through the clearing, a voice that cut through the whispers like a knife. "No, Jack, you can't give it what it wants." Mrs. Halverson emerged from the shadows, her frail frame seeming impossibly small against the monstrous trees towering above. In her hands she held a small bundle wrapped in a piece of worn cloth. "The forest thrives on despair," she said, her voice shaking. "But there's another way. A bargain can be struck, but only with the right offering." "What are you talking about?" Jack demanded, his heart hammering in his chest. "I'm offering myself." Mrs. Halverson shook her head, her eyes fierce. "It's not your life it truly wants, boy. It's your soul, your despair, your willingness to give up everything you hold dear. But if we can offer it something more powerful, something it cannot resist, we might be able to break its hold." With trembling hands, Mrs. Halverson unwrapped the cloth, revealing an old, rusted locket. "This belonged to the first child ever taken by the forest," she explained. "A girl who willingly offered herself to save her family. But she did so with hope, not despair. That is the secret." The clearing seemed to hum with anger, the trees swaying violently as if trying to drown out her words. The whispers turned into screams, the forest thrashing like a wounded animal. But Mrs. Halverson continued, her voice steady. "Jack, Lily, hold this locket together," she commanded. "Focus on your love for each other, on your hope. It's the only thing strong enough to break the forest's grip." Lily reached out, her small hand trembling as she touched the cold metal of the locket. Jack placed his hand over hers, and together they closed their eyes. "Please," Jack whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "let us go. Let us be free." The air around them seemed to change, the oppressive darkness lifting ever so slightly. The screams of the forest grew more frantic, like 1,000 voices crying out in anguish. But the ground beneath their feet began to stabilize, the twisted branches retracting. The ghostly figure of their mother let out an inhuman shriek, dissolving into mist as the light from the locket intensified, casting the clearing in a warm golden glow. The trees around them convulsed, their bark cracking, dark sap oozing like blood. The whispers turned into agonized wails, and then suddenly they stopped. The forest fell silent, the fog lifted, revealing the familiar path that led back to their home. "It's over," Mrs. Halverson said softly, tears streaming down her face. "You did it. The forest's hunger is sated for now." Jack and Lily embraced, sobbing with relief, their knees buckling, as the weight of everything they had endured crashed down on them. The clearing, once filled with malevolent energy, was now quiet and still. Mrs. Halverson knelt beside them, her frail hand resting on Jack's shoulder. "Your mother's sacrifice gave you the chance to break the curse," she said. "The forest may still be dangerous, but it no longer has a hold on you. It's time to leave this place and never return." Epilogue. A week later, the Peterson family home stood empty. The windows were boarded up, the driveway covered in fallen leaves. Jack and Lily, along with their father, had moved far away from Hollow Brook, carrying only their memories and a few belongings. But the forest remained, its twisted trees still whispered in the wind, its shadows still danced beneath the moonlight, and deep within its heart, beyond the reach of sunlight, the ancient hunger stirred once more. The forest would wait, it always did. And it was patient, because it knew that someday someone would come, and the whispers would begin again.